So, wrapping up our discussion of the CRAP test and evaluating resources, coming to the close with purpose, which to me is one of the hardest things to learn to evaluate. And some people are inherently better at it, but I think there are steps and things everyone can do to make themselves better at evaluating the purpose and the bias that's in information as it's being presented to you. So going back to our CRAP test, purpose really deals with the reason the source or information exists and doesn't have a presence of bias or prejudice. So what is the purpose of the information? Is this information being given to you to inform, teach, to sell you something? Is it meant to be entertainment? Is it meant to be persuasive? So why is the author, either a person or organization, giving you this knowledge and giving you this info? What is their intent behind it? Do the authors or sponsors or organization make their intentions or purpose clear? For things that are academic resources like published books and published journal articles, this is pretty much inherently, it is to educate and to present new and original information and research, to discuss certain topics. And so that is their purpose in giving you this information, is to further knowledge and learning. But when you're looking at things that are more magazines, more news, things that are published online and being given to you through other news and media sites, you have to start really being critical of, why is this information being given to me? And so credible people I would suggest listening to will tell you up front, this is why I'm giving it to you, this is what we do. And so just like when you're looking at authority, credible people tell you who they are, that they give you their name, they give you their organization, they give you kind of what it is they do, where they're getting their info. They're also giving you some information about why they're doing this, why does their organization exist, what is their purpose, and giving you this info. And so lots of times, even credible people that have a bias and that are trying to persuade you to opinions, if they're upfront about, this is what we're doing, it's someone that I might be more willing to listen to, that they're giving me factual information that supports their opinions versus they're manipulating information to deceive me or to encourage me to think a certain way. So this is really where you have to be very critical of people. And that's where I say this is one of the most difficult things for me personally to do. I can be a bit of a trusting person. I take people at face value, and so I don't think, oh, do they have a more nefarious plot on why they're giving me this info? But there are things you can do that we're going to talk about today to start looking at that. Another thing to look at is, what is the information? Is it fact, opinion, propaganda? So even when you're looking at newspapers or published media, you have different elements of those, that you get things that are news reports, that this is fact about this event happened and here's the detail to what happened. But you also get things like opinion pieces and editorials where people are presenting their thoughts and views on this information or event or idea that they're talking about. And so those need to be taken as opinions. They're not hard facts. This is what someone believes. Now, credible people tell you why they believe it and why you should believe it as well. And so they start supporting that with evidence. But you need to, if you're using that, present it as an opinion, not as a fact or a report of an event. So keep that in mind. And like I said, credible people that you want to listen to, credible publications. We've seen this with some of our news things I've looked at this semester, that you get that heading of editorial or opinion before the title of the piece that is telling you up front that this is what this is. This is how we're presenting this opinion article, where this person who works in this field or has experience with it is giving you their opinion on a particular idea or event. And so they're telling you up front with that. So they're very clear about what the purpose of it is. Does the point of view appear objective and impartial? You really want to look at that if they're presenting it as fact. Are they being objective and showing both sides of things? Are they being leaving emotion out of it? So a lot of looking at opinion and looking at bias is, are they leading with reason and logic, or are they leading with emotion on that? So do they appear objective and impartial? And are there known political, ideological, cultural, religious, institutional, or personal biases within this? And so what you're really looking at with that is, does the bias Is it so strong that it skews reality? Everyone, myself included, has personal biases that are taught to us from a child, that are based upon our view of the world and how we relate to it. And so everyone has a bias, but part of being a critical consumer of info is identifying that and being able to identify it in others. That everyone's going to have a bias, but when that becomes a problem is when your bias is so strong that you can't accept or take in information that might contradict it, or you are manipulating fact and taking things out of context, reporting things with a skew on what actually happened so that it supports your bias instead of reporting reality and things like that. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. So looking at the CRAP test, so evaluating news, really what we're looking at with this module is news media. Biggest thing is to be aware. Be aware that bad information is out there. Be aware that even some of the most prominent news organizations have their own bias and no one is perfect. I can't think of a single news organization that is 100% middle of the road objective. Everyone has some sort of bias, and so to be aware of how that's being presented to you and when that bias becomes a problem. Also be aware of things like fake news and clickbait when you're looking online and looking at resources. Be aware of things that have multiple purposes, partisan bias, things like that. And so why do you need to become this critical consumer of news media? It increases your own credibility of knowing what it is you're thinking and talking about and how you're accepting information about the world around you. It helps you identify suitable sources and to use them with confidence and to use them with accuracy as well. And it also helps you reduce the spread of information, of misinformation. I don't think any of you are unaware of this idea of fake news, of how things on social media and news media in general have caused very divisive views within the country. I don't think any of you are probably unaware of the whole Russian meddling scandal that's been going on since the 2016 election for the past 4 years, of how Russia specifically manipulated news and what was being put out there to skew people's viewpoints and how they voted. So by being a critical consumer yourself, and so allows you to stop the spread, let the evil stop with you and let the bad info stop with you, of being aware of your own personal responsibility as an adult and how you consume and share this. All right, so strategies for critically consuming news is to know your resources. So I think I had a student a few years ago who was asking me, well, how do you know that a particular news source, I think she was talking about Fox News, is conservative, that it has a conservative bent? And it kind of stunned me because I was so aware of it, I didn't remember learning it. But the more you engage with these type of sources, the more you learn what is credible and what is factual. And so you're able to confidently go with people that have a good reputation. So knowing your news sources. If you don't know your news sources, that's what we're going to talk about today. It's a good idea to look them up. If this is coming from something you've never heard of, it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means you're unaware of it, and it's impossible for everyone to know everything. So we're going to talk about some strategies on how to look that up today. Another thing for critically consuming news is to corroborate and investigate. That if you are to look at multiple sources, don't just take one newspaper or one media outlet and say that is all the information I need to know about the world. Look at multiple. I'm a big fan of also, if you're looking at, I said partisan bias, what that means is that you are either more Democratic or Republican in news media, that you're more conservative versus liberal in your political opinions. I'm a big fan of looking at news media on both sides of that spectrum. So you're getting a balanced viewpoint. You're getting what liberals are saying about an event versus what conservatives are saying. And then you can get both sides of an equation and form your own opinions. But it also helps you corroborate and investigate of, is the news being reported to you actually factual? And how is it being presented? Is it being presented accurately? Another thing is to look at language. Very emotionally driven language of sensationalism, of language that uses words and punctuation that if you were to read it out loud, that you're going to be putting a lot of emotion in it, and you're going to be like raising your voice and being very emotional as you speak of it, that is playing on your emotions and trying to get a reaction out of you. Good, solid news media reporting is supposed to be very objective, and so it's kind of flat and boring. It doesn't have a lot of emotion written into the language. And so look at how the language being used. Is it meant to draw on your emotion and an emotional reaction to something to get you to support it? And also recognize the author's goal with that. So make sure you're looking at why are they giving you this info? What is their purpose in it? All right, some places that are good that if you are not familiar with whether a newspaper or media source off the bat has any sort of bias or political or ideological leaning, it's a good idea to look at some of these sites. And so looking at the about source of credible people tell you who they are, they have an about section, is a good place to start. So coming back to that example, I said I had a student who kind of was like, well, how did you know Fox News was conservative? They tell you up front. That is their goal. They are a conservative media news resource. And so they're telling you that in their about section that they're saying, yes, we have a point of view, but here's that point of view, and they're acknowledging it. Wikipedia, if you're looking at news evaluation, Googling what is this source and what is their history and reputation with Wikipedia from a librarian perspective isn't a bad thing, adding that to your general knowledge bank. But you also got these two websites, Media Bias Fact Check and allsides.org are websites that bring up and compare news media. And so if you're trying to find a place to where you're like, you have this event that has occurred, so like Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away in the past week, and you're like, well, you're trying to get a balanced view of how people are reporting this and talking about it. This can be a place that you can search for it, and it brings you sites from both conservative versus liberal and central information. And so you're seeing this left center, right center biased kind of things of how are people talking about this and what are the resources talking about it. You can also look for specific resources. And so if we are looking for something, say we are looking for New York Times, you can search to say, well, I'm looking at this newspaper or this news media source that I found information about it, and I want to know, does it have any sort of bias? Does it have any sort of propaganda goals and things like that? And so it can bring you this, and they're kind of using, and so it gives you their background of, they say that the New York Times is left center bias, so it does have a little bit of a liberal left sort of lean to how they report and how they present things. And then they tell you why they think that and why they think they're credible or not credible, and giving you that kind of information. And so All Sides does this as well. I kind of like All Sides over Media Bias Fact Check, but it looks at sort of the same idea of, it can give you that balance search. You can look for specific resources within it. So if you're looking at something called newspaper called The Hill, is that conservative or liberal? How do they present it? Is this something that, even though it has a bias, I'd want to listen to? And so these can be some good tools to help you learn about these resources, that if you're not familiar with them, educate yourself, look that up, and be aware of it. All right. I don't know if any of y'all have seen this chart before. This is something that came out a few years ago, coming from this Vanessa Otero in 2016, comparing the bias and credibility of very popular, well-known news media outlets. And so if you are looking for factual info to where bias, even though if it does have a bias, it's not affecting the accuracy of the info, it's not affecting the credibility of the site, you generally want to stay in this center. I kind of call it the center of objectivity. So you have things that are very central, you have things that are slightly left, slightly right, but you really want to kind of stay around this gray circle here. Another thing this chart analyzes is kind of the complexity of the reporting and the writing. And so you have things, the very popular things that are kind of sitting center here that says it meets this high standards. And so it is complex writing, it's complex thought. With that, you get, the further up you go, you start getting more analytical and more complex, that's giving you more in-depth info. But then you have some very Popular ones, local TV news, USA Today, CNN, that even though they're kind of sitting center politically, that they're not really heavily biased, they're also not very complex. They're giving you very, very basic views. And so it kind of leads into meeting the high standards, but going down to sensational clickbait. And so you're seeing, you don't get things in terms of left to right, political, conservative versus liberal viewpoints. You don't have anything up here with complex. When you go very far out on the spectrum and you move far away from this center, you get very simple. And so you have things like InfoWars and Blaze and the Daily Beast and stuff like that, versus Addicting Info and Occupy Democrats and US Uncut, that are very down here, very, very far extremist views of left versus right, but they're also very, very simple. They don't get into complex. And so I think that says something about, if you can't have complex thought or discussion about something, they are so biased that they're skewing the truth and skewing reality, and they're doing so with malicious intent. They're doing so to deceive and to bring people to their way of viewing. So these are really bad sources that you don't want to get facts from. That if you're looking at these sites, it is not to say this is what is actually happening, kind of way down here. So lots of, for academic research and even for daily life, kind of the center of objectivity. If you're looking out over here, so like the Atlantic and Slate versus the Hill and the Economist and sort of things, that they are slightly left, slightly right, just be aware of that. Be aware of, it has a slightly conservative or slightly liberal viewpoint, and take that into consideration of how you're using the information, of also how you're presenting it, of saying that this person said this and it comes from this site that has a slightly political viewpoint, but I'm going to say it's accurate because of that, or it's not accurate because of that. So kind of take that into your consideration. But really, this very central thing of NPR, BBC, Washington Post, New York Times, you're seeing they're a little bit left. Most things are a little bit. PBS is a little bit right. CBS News is a little bit right. But lots of things within this very gray circle is a good place to be. All right, so true or false? News article can be both accurate and biased. True, it can. Everyone has a bias. Even those central things have slightly biased viewpoints, but it can't. You need to be aware of it. The biggest thing with bias is to be aware of it, to be aware of your own biases and others. A news source only publishes news articles that reflect its perspective. Not true. Sometimes credible newspapers will publish facts that, regardless of their perspective of in events that happen, they will also sometimes post editorials and opinion pieces that contradict their viewpoint and challenge it and things like that. That part of good conversation is disagreeing with each other, but then supporting why you disagree. And then analyzing the tone of an article may help you determine if the article is biased. Absolutely. Of looking at the language being used, and are they being sensational? Are they being emotional in how they're presenting their facts? Are they taking things deliberately out of context? So maybe looking back at the original sources, if they're quoting something else, can show you the tone of the article, can help you determine if it's biased.